Okay, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. Again, welcome to the Native American Agriculture Fast Track Fund LOI webinar. And we are excited to present a variety of different information, and we apologize to those of you who logged on last week, and unfortunately we encountered some audio difficulties that were beyond our control, so we apologize for that. But we're grateful for those of you that were able to sign on again today for the webinar, and we also want to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the NAAFTF website by tomorrow. So let's go ahead and get started. Next slide, please. So I'd like to introduce the principals that are going to be involved in the NAAFTF process. I'd first like to introduce Christine Weber, who's joining us today from Cohen, Milstein, Sellers, and Toll, and she will be part of the Q&A process. Again, EchoHawk Consulting is serving as the grants process, and I'm joined on my team by Marion Quinlan and Maggie Rice, who will, Marion will be a presenter today, and Maggie is in charge of our technical assistance process. An important part of this process will be the advisory committee, which is represented by 6 individuals with experience and expertise in the fields of Native American farming, ranching, and philanthropy. They will be in charge of reviewing all the LOIs, and grant applications will make recommendations to Cost Council. Obviously, an important part of this process is the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia that approved the Keepseagle settlement, and they will be in charge of the process in terms of making final approvals on grant awards. It should be noted that the court's order is open for appeal through June 20th. So if an appeal is filed, June 24th will be the deadline. Will be allowed to move forward, but then the action will be suspended until there's a decision. Next slide. And I'd like to turn it over to Christine to give an overview, please.
Hi, this is Christine Weber, and I am one of many class counsel who have been working on this case since 1999, and we're delighted to have gotten this far. Just a few points of background for those of you who are not familiar with the Keepseagle case. This was a suit filed on behalf of Native American farmers and ranchers who experienced discrimination by USDA with respect to the Farm Loan Program. The case was litigated for about 15 years prior to a settlement being reached. That settlement led to a lengthy claims process in which 3,600 prevailing claimants were compensated for their claims, but it left $380 million unclaimed. Pursuant to a modification of the agreement, although the initial awards were capped, there was an agreement that was reached and has been approved by the district court that will provide an additional payment of $21,275 to each prevailing claimant. Part of that goes to the IRS, but the bulk of the funds will go directly to the prevailing claimants from that section of the award. Then about $265 million will be used to establish a trust called the Native American Agriculture Fund. That is going to take some time to get up and running. It should be up the next year to 2 years at the outside. They should be accepting grant applications. But there was a strong desire to have some money distributed to the community on a much faster process than the trust would be able to accomplish. And so $38 million from the settlement was designated for what we are calling the Native American Agriculture Fast Track Fund. And that is our goal, to get the funds out to benefit the community as soon as possible, and the timeline is going to be pretty tight. Awards are going to range in size depending on the applicant's budget, the focus, the number of people who could be assisted, and we are considering applications from intermediary applicants who have grant programs that could be expanded through additional funds from the Fast Track Fund. And I'm going to say next slide and turn it back over to Crystal.
Thank you, Christine. So what we want to do is briefly move through and really make sure that we highlight some key dates for those of you that are going to be interested in applying. So please note that the LOI application period is May 25th through June 24th, with the deadline being Friday, June 24th at 5 p.m. Mountain Time, but that's also 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 6 p.m. Central, and 7 p.m. Eastern. No exceptions. And then the next stage of the process will really begin in terms of the review period from June 25th through July 27th. And this will be when the advisory committee and the class council will be reviewing all LOI applications for review. On July 28th, all applicants will receive some level of notification whether or not they were being invited to participate in the second stage of the process, which will incorporate or will include submitting a full application, or you will receive your decline letter. And again, that will be on July 28th. Next slide. July 28th through September 4th will be the full proposal period. And again, only those organizations receiving a full formal invitation will be eligible to submit a full proposal for consideration. The deadline will be September 4th, again at 4 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Mountain, 6 p.m. Central, and 7 p.m. Eastern. September 5th through October 9th will be the full proposal review period, again, where the advisory committee and the class council will review the applications and make recommendations on the grant awards. On October 17th, the class council will submit these recommendations on the grant awards to the court. And then we're thinking that the disbursement of grant awards will most likely happen by mid-December in the absence of any appeal. Next slide. And I'd now like to turn it over to my colleague, Marion Quinlan, to talk about eligibility.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for participating today. Really happy to be here. I did want to make a note that the orange highlights in this webinar slide series are links to information in the downloadable PDF of the webinar slides that we put up online. First of all, to be eligible, you must document that you provided business assistance, agricultural education, technical support, or advocacy services to Native farmers or ranchers between January 1, 1981 and November 1, 2010. All applicants must be based in the United States and must be one of the following types of organizations: a 501c3 nonprofit, a 7871 nonprofit, educational institution, or instrumentality of a state or federally recognized tribe. Next slide, please. The following applicants and uses of funds are not eligible: entities that did not provide business assistance, agricultural education, technical support, or advocacy services to Native farmers or ranchers between 1981 and November 1, 2010. Projects that do not provide assistance designed to further Native farming or ranching activities, or do not ultimately assist individual farmers or ranchers. Projects that assist individual farmers or ranchers, but the services are not agriculture related. Use of funds that are not restricted exclusively to charitable and educational purposes. Use of funds for emergency funding, such as for addressing natural disasters. Use of funding for litigation, political activity, or lobbying. Applicants using a fiscal agent also are not eligible. Next slide, please. There's $38 million to be distributed from Fast Track Fund for one time only. There's a pretty wide range of services that could be funded. Fast Track funding must serve Native farmers and/or ranchers, or those seeking to become farmers or ranchers. All proposed services must promote their engagement in agriculture, which is defined as the cultivation, raising, or harvesting of plants or animals for food or other products. This could include fishing and foraging and raising products for purposes other than food. We're requesting that applicants submit only one LOI. If you submit more than one LOI, only the first one you submit will be reviewed. Allowed uses of funds are project support, endowment funding, capital expenses, regranting, and scholarships. If you're seeking funding for one or more of these categories, these expenses would be included altogether in one proposal budget. Funding is for a maximum of 2 years. Requests for endowments and capital funding will be given a lower priority. Next slide, please. More about allowable use of funds. For people who want to know how much money to ask for, There is no maximum or minimum request amount set. But you should keep in mind that the advisory committee may weigh the size of your request in comparison to your organization size and your ability to manage the funds. We do want to remind you about the IRS regulations regarding the public support test for charities, which is also known as the tipping point. Basically, charities need to demonstrate a sufficiently diverse base of public support in order to not be considered a private foundation. We can't give you any legal advice about whether a grant from the Fast Track would put your organization in jeopardy of losing its tax-exempt status, but we want you to be aware of this rule and take it into consideration when determining how much funding you might request. We strongly encourage you to seek your own legal guidance about the tipping point for your organization. We've got a document available online on the Indian Farm Class website and as a link in the downloadable PDF of this webinar slides that has more information. Next slide, please. Talking about the budget and how to calculate indirect costs. Indirect costs cover general overhead expenses such as rent, utilities, accounting staff, auditor, non-litigation legal expenses, administrative staff, and equipment. For projects, you can calculate indirect at 15% of the overall project cost. For line items related to scholarships or regranting funds, applicants can calculate indirect at 3% of those costs. No indirect should be included on a line item seeking endowment funds. Next slide, please. Factors that will be considered by the advisory committee include both eligibility considerations and whether and how your request fulfills the purposes of the Fast Track Fund. Basically, those factors are the services provided to Native farmers or ranchers between 1981 and November 1, 2010. What your plans are to serve Native farmers or ranchers with the Fast Track funds. The size of your organization related to the amount requested. Your organization's leadership. Links to the Native community and to Native leadership. And completion of the LOI application and the 2 required attachments. Next slide. Talking about the 2 required attachments for the LOI process, the first needs to document your tax status as being within eligibility requirements. The other attachment is a resolution from your board or tribal council. We have a model resolution available online in the LOI application form that you can download that has some suggested language. Basically, the resolution must briefly describe services provided to Native farmers or ranchers between 1981 and November 1, 2010. The resolution should state your intention to allocate any funds received to further Native farming or ranching activities, to keep on track with what you outline in your proposal, and to comply with the Internal Revenue Code. These are also required for dedicated endowment funding. The resolution will also affirm your intention to use any Fast Track funds awarded to not supplant any other funds you receive, and to use these funds as you state in your proposal. And now we're going to hear a bit from Aaron Spevacek from Foundant, who will tell us about the online LOI process.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. My name is Aaron Spevacek. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. What I'd like to do now is show you how you'll apply for the LOI. And I'm starting on the Indian Farm Class homepage. From there, there's a link to click in to get more information, including, and you'll see this in a couple places, click here to register and start your LOI application. So this is the button that you'll click from the Indian Farm Class website that takes you into the system where you're going to submit your LOI. That brings up this page here, and the first step you'll need to go through is to create a new account. So I'll go through that quickly. As you create a new account, you're going to be prompted to put in information like your organization name, and when appropriate, put in things like your EIN. You'll also be able to put in your website, a phone number for the organization, an address, And you'll notice that some of these things, like the website's not required. You won't have to enter that. On the other hand, address and phone number are required. Note that when you enter the state, you are going to have to put in the state using the proper two initial code. So if I was applying from Montana, I'd put in MT as opposed to spelling out Montana. All right, so I enter some very basic information about the organization, go to the next step, and it's going to ask me for my information. So here I'm going to put in my information. Again, there are fields like middle name and suffix that you can skip, but some fields like the prefix, first name, last name are required. To title or role in the organization, you'll have to figure out what's appropriate. If you have a specific title, I might be the vice president, but you could also put in volunteer, whatever makes sense, whatever describes your role in the organization. You will be logging into the system with your email address, so it's important that you enter that here and that you use an email address that you have access to. We do ask you to enter it twice to make sure it's entered correctly. And again, a telephone number. This is different than the phone number. It might be the same number, but this would be your phone number as opposed to the organization's phone number if there's a difference between the two. When it comes to the address, we do let you copy your address from the organization. So if I'm located in a different location than the organization itself, I would have a different address here. But if I'm working out of the same office as the organization, using the same address, I can just copy the address. After I enter my information, it's going to ask me if I'm the project director. And if you are, we'll continue to the next step. But if you're not the project director, the site's going to ask you to enter the same kinds of information for the project director. All right, once you've entered information on the organization, yourself as the applicant and the project director, we're going to ask you for a password. We'll ask you to enter that twice. And then we're going to send you an email. And that's a pretty important part of the process because you will be receiving emails from the system. So what we want to do is make sure that the emails that we send you don't end up in your spam filter. So you can check your inbox. If you've got the email, great. You can say, I've received the email, and you can continue. If you've not, you can continue without checking, although we don't suggest this. Instead, if you've not received the email, there's a tutorial here which will tell you how you can go and find that email if it got caught in your junk mail or your email folder. I'll show you what that email looks like. So this email just came to my inbox, and it says that I registered for the Echo Hawk Consulting Online application, and here is my username. All right, so I can say that I've got the email. That allows me to know that I'll get future emails from the site, and I'm going to continue in. So I've now completed the registration process. I have an account on the site, and here I am. So when you first come in the first time, we're going to take you right to this page, the Apply page. This shows you the opportunity that's available. If you'd like, you can preview the LOI by clicking this preview button, and it opens a copy of the form that you're going to be filling out. This can be helpful because it allows you to gather the documents you're going to need to gather. The other thing you can do at any point in the process is hit this question list button that you'll see. This generates a PDF. It actually downloads onto your computer a PDF copy of the LOI that you need to fill out, including all the information provided at the top, and down here, all of the questions you're going to need to answer. So you can use this if you'd like as a checklist just to make sure you've meet all the eligibility criteria, and then as you go down through the actual LOI, you can figure out what your answers are going to be, what you need to gather. So that preview is there. I can simply go back on my browser once I've been previewing to get back to the supply page, and then when I'm ready, click Apply. Clicking Apply starts to create a draft LOI. So now I'm creating a draft LOI. Notice I do have the opportunity to change my contact information if I need to change something that I've entered earlier. If the organization, if I made a mistake, you can make a change here. And then you go ahead and fill out your LOI. At the top of the LOI, we have a lot of instructions, and once you've read them, it's a long list, you can go ahead and click on this little arrow here to collapse that. After that, there's some things you need to agree to. Notice that at a few places in the form that you'll be filling out, there are hyperlinks. Clicking on the hyperlink will open in another tab or download to your downloads folder some more information. Moving through here, I need to declare my tax status, upload a file if I haven't done, so I'll go. I'm just uploading a random file, but you'll need to upload a file that probably an IRS determination letter or whatever you have that documents that, and then moving on. So I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. You'll obviously need to read these questions. What I'd like to show you is that when you're finished with a group of questions, you can collapse that group of questions so you don't need to go through that every time you come back into the LOI. There are different types of questions. So what we were looking at before were questions that just had a simple yes, no. Click yes or click no. Here we have a place where I can enter text. When you're entering text into the online form, note that we're counting characters. In this particular question, you're allowed up to 1,500 characters. That includes letters. It also includes numbers, punctuation marks, and spaces. So it's all characters that are included in there. Other places in the application, you'll be prompted a budget number. So you'll have to enter a number. It wouldn't accept it if I'm trying to type letters, and it won't accept letters in there because we're just looking for the number. When it comes to dates, you can type in the date if you want, or by clicking in this date box, you can select a date. Notice there are some questions, here you have to answer yes or no, but there are some questions where you can enter multiple things. So if you're applying for multiple uses, you would click more than one of these boxes. Here under the states, for example, if you're working statewide, which states are you working? If you make your way through the LOI, our system is saving as you go. And so we're trying to save your answers as you go, including if you upload anything, we'll save that. But you don't have to finish it all at once. In fact, when I get down here to the bottom, if I'm not ready to submit, I can go ahead and save it. I'm going to go ahead and save that. That saves everything that I've entered. I can log out. And when I log back in, so I could go up here, here's my name up here. This is where I could edit my profile, edit my organization. Same thing I can do here. And I can sign out. To save time, I won't sign out. But when you sign out, well, here, I'll sign out. You can sign back in. When you sign in, you're going to come to our dashboard. The dashboard is a little bit different than the screen you saw when you first signed in. When you first signed in, we went through the registration process and then took you right to the apply page where you can start a new LOI. Once you've begun an LOI, when you come back in, we're going to take you to the dashboard. This is where you can see the status of your LOI. And you can see that I've already created a draft LOI here. So rather than applying, starting anew, I'm going to edit the LOI and finish working on it. I've read this. I don't need to read it again. I can minimize that. If I've answered all these questions, I can minimize those. I can come in and change any answers at this point. Upload files, do whatever I need to do. The system will prompt you if you haven't answered all the required questions. So in this case, I obviously haven't answered all the required questions. I can hit Submit LOI, and it's going to give me a list of all of the questions I haven't answered, and they're flagged in red if I were to go through here. Once I've answered the questions, I can go ahead and submit LOI. That will automatically send a copy to the folks who are doing the grant management. And at that point, once you've submitted the LOI, you can no longer make changes. So you'll want to save your LOI while you're working on it and only submit it when you know it's ready to go. At any point, you can come up to the top here and click this button to get a PDF of the questions, or click this LOI packet button. This will give you a PDF copy downloaded of the responses that you've replied to the LOI before. So this is going to show me how I've answered all the questions. So here's where I was asked what the tax status was, and here was my selected answer. Actually, here's the selected answer. This is the list of possible answers. So this is a way of documenting your LOI so you have a copy to save. It also, because this is still in draft, would give you a chance to go and read your answers, proofread, get anyone else to sign off on it. And this will include, down at the bottom, anything you've attached. So here's the document I attached when I was asked to attach a copy of something that documented my tax status. So this is a place where you can attach, we will pull all the attachments in here, so you've got one document that has both all of your answers up to that point and the attachments. All right, I believe that takes me through everything I was going to run through. I'll stick around for questions like everyone else.
Okay, and while we're waiting, I see that we're having a lot of questions coming in, and I do encourage everybody to continue sending in the questions. And we're going to start, our panel is going to start responding to these questions. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Crystal at this point.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to our presenters. And as Marion stated, we do have a number of questions coming in. And we're going to do our best in the time allotted to get through these questions. Luckily, we've actually gotten through the first part of the presentation more quickly than we originally imagined, so we'll have some additional time for Q&A. So I want to go ahead and get started with one of the first questions, in which that came in was that if an applicant feels that they should have been awarded, can the applicant file an appeal? And I'd like to have Christine address that question, please.
Hi. There is not an appeals process built into this. I mean, this is not really a legal process at this point. Class counsel are required to make recommendations to the court. We want to make this as open and fair a process as possible and get good input so that we can make good recommendations. But frankly, you know, we could have just, without any application process, just submitted our recommendations to the court. So as far as our making recommendations, that's not subject to any appeal. And then the court has the authority to approve or disapprove those recommendations. And I can't give you legal advice right now as to whether there's any circumstances under which those determinations could be appealed. It's certainly not anticipated, and if there is any appeal, it puts at risk the whole purpose of getting funds out quickly to the community, because if there's an appeal, then that means nobody can be prevented from distributing money, or most likely would be if there had to be some held to consider alternative applicants after an appeal. So we hope that there is no appeal, and I don't know that there would be any jurisdiction for an appeal. But in terms of whether there's anything out there, as I said, if somebody wanted to consult their own lawyer, they could certainly do so, but we hope that there will not be anything of that nature, since this is not really a legal dispute. This is, at this point, sort of a philanthropical enterprise rather than a legal one.
Great. Thank you so much, Christine. One of our next questions is the FAQs mention that funding cannot be used for general support. Can you please define what constitutes general support? And I'd like to ask Marion to provide some feedback on that. Did we lose Marion? Marion, are you on mute?
Sorry, is that better?
There we go. We've got you. Yes,
right.
Marion, general support.
General support is, funding for the organization's budget to fulfill the organization's mission, which may or may not be specifically allocated to helping Native farmers or ranchers. So we're requesting organizations submit more restricted requests related to project support and so on that we've talked about, because we're requesting that any funding that the Fast Track funds are going to distribute are allocated specifically for purposes allowable by the Fast Track fund. So that means that we're not going to be looking at general support requests, which with that funding would be spent at the discretion of the organization. So we're requesting more specific funding requests.
Great. Thanks, Marion. So our next question is if an entity applies under the Fast Track Fund, will that factor into their application for the later distribution of funds once the trust is established? And I will turn that question over to Christine.
Officially, these are unrelated entities. The trust has a board of directors that's been approved by the court. They will be setting their own policies. They will be setting their own, making their own determinations, and I can't speak as to what they will do. The only thing I can tell you is that because we don't have any ongoing organization with the Fast Track Fund, we have decided that the reports that we've asked each grant recipient to make back to class council, we are going to transmit those to the trust in the hopes that they will take that as information that might be useful to them in their decision making. But we can't speak for what they will do. There's definitely no guarantee that funding from the Fast Track Fund will lead to further funding in the future from the trust. And the reverse is absolutely the case, because there are some specific requirements that must be met for the Fast Track Fund that do not have to be met for the trust. And so the fact that somebody is denied funding by the Fast Track Fund should not count against them in being considered by the trust. So there is no formal linkage.
Great. Thanks, Christine. And then I'm going to turn another question right back over to Christine here as well. And the question is, on the 2-year expenditure rule, does this carry over to regrants and or scholarships? For example, if we wanted to use award funds to give a 4-year scholarship to support Native American agriculture majors, would that be possible? Or if we set up a micro-loan program for Native American farmers and ranchers, would they be required to expend their loan funds before the 24-month deadline? Christine?
The 2-year or 24 months rule means that you will have to have committed the funds, not just committed generally to a scholarship program, but awarded a specific individual the scholarship, awarded a specific individual a loan. But the term of that scholarship would not be so limited.
Great. Thank you so much. Our next question is a resolution required for the LOI or the full application? And right now, we're only dealing with the letter of inquiry application period, and it is absolutely mandatory. So you actually can't even submit your LOI application without uploading your resolution. The system will actually stop you. So we really want to encourage folks. That's probably one of the more difficult things given the time frame, to be able to obtain a resolution from whatever governing body of the applicant. And so we really encourage you to really pursue that and get that secured so that you can submit it with your application. And within the application form itself, we have provided model language on that. Okay, so moving on to our next question. We've received a couple different questions about endowments. One is really looking for more of a definition about what we mean by an endowment. We've also received some questions if there are any specific restrictions on the use of earnings, if a history of managing an endowment is required, and are there any time limits on the endowment and its use related to the project? And a final question would be around, is an investment policy required for the endowment? So I'm going to turn this to you, Christine.
Okay, I hope I remember all those questions. Just prompt me if I miss one.
I will.
By an endowment, we mean a fund that is permanently invested with the earnings being used for the designated project, rather than just a pot of money that is spent over a period of time. So you end up with the principal that gets invested, and it's the earnings from that principal that will support a long-term project. Therefore, while the endowment would be set up within the 2-year period, the interest earned on the endowment would fund a project long into the future. So this is very unusual and is not, we're not expecting much, if any, of the $38 million to be expended in such a way, but we are at least going to consider such applications. And such applications would absolutely have to show, and this is in the model resolution language, that the earnings from the endowment would be permanently designated for programs that fall within the scope of what we're funding, and those are laid out in detail in the model resolution and in the frequently asked questions documents, both of which are available through the website. In terms of needing to have experience in managing an endowment, certainly that would be helpful in make for a stronger application, but it's not written into the requirements that one has to have already had an endowment in order to apply. And in terms of having an investment policy, I would say not for the LOI. That's not one of the questions asked in the LOI. But when we come to the full application, if we get to that stage, we would expect to see that an organization has adopted appropriate policies governing investment and management of any endowment that we might consider awarding. Did I cover all of the endowment questions?
You did. You did great. That's a multi-pronged question, so thank you. Okay, moving on to our next question. If a tribal college is an educational institution with a 501c3 status, what type of formal documentation is required? A tribal charter, question mark. So, Marion, I want to turn this question over to you.
Right, and if you have 501c3 status, uploading a copy of that IRS letter should be sufficient. I hope I'm answering that question thoroughly. That not something else is not meant.
Okay, so if that attendee doesn't feel like that totally covered everything regarding their question, please feel free to another question. Right. But we'll move on to the next one. What do you mean about how the work integrates community accountability and Native leadership? Can you give an example? So, Christine, wondering if you might be able to give some insight on this.
Okay. Well, with Native leadership, that you'll see in the LOI application, one of the things we ask about is the composition of the board of directors and staff, wanting to know if Native Americans are amongst the leaders of the organization, because that certainly, while it's not a specific requirement, it's one piece of information we look at to see that there are those specific ties to the population that this money is supposed to serve. And in terms of the accountability to the community, again, we're looking at how an organization is structured and how they receive input from the community that we're trying to serve here amongst Native American farmers and ranchers, to ensure that the programs that they are putting forward are going to be ones that are actually of benefit to the community, actually serving needs as the community sees them, and not just something that the organization has decided its own agenda, regardless of how that fits into the community. And so we're just looking for a variety of structures that that different organizations use to ensure that they maintain those community ties and that community input. And that's the sort of thing that we will be looking for in evaluating the applications.
Great. Thank you so much, Christine. And we did get a question if we're expecting the Fondant Grants online management system to suffer any slowdowns or crashes based on the volume of applications, and absolutely not. We really strongly believe in the system and company that will be administering this online process for us. So, moving on to our next question, which is, are costs related to conferences and convenings, i.e. room costs, AV rentals, supplies, etc., allowed under the project support category? And I'm going to turn that question over to Marion.
And I would answer that question as a yes. As long as your project and project activities are going to fulfill the spirit of the Fast Track Fund, which is to serve native farmers or ranchers or those interested in becoming native farmers or ranchers, and with that being an agricultural focus for your services, I would say that those costs are definitely allowable.
Thanks, Marion. So our next question is will the LOI form be available now? So yes, it's actually been available since May 25th. So we encourage you to go to the website at www.indianfarmclass.com/NAAFTF.ASPX. And there's a nice big green button right in the center of the page that is a prompt for you to register to apply for the LOI. So you actually do have to go through the registration process that Erin outlined earlier. So moving on to our next question. Does the time requirement serving Native American farmers and ranchers between January 1st, 1981 and December 2010 mean continuous service for the entire 29-year time frame, or does it mean that sometime between 1981 and 2010 the organization must have provided services? Can you give an example? So, Christine, I'm going to turn that question over to you.
Sure. Literally speaking, the requirement can be met with a single year of service during that 29-year time span. As a practical matter, as we're going to be evaluating the applications, as I understand the advisory committee is going to be evaluating the applications, greater length and greater continuity of service is going to be weighted very strongly, and that's going to be an important factor. Because we don't have a traditional grant-making organization with grant officers who are going to be checking in and getting reports back on a regular basis, and providing that sort of oversight and audit and accountability that you ordinarily have with a grant process, it's very important to us that any organizations that we recommend to the court, we do so with some confidence that they have a really strong track record in providing services within the scope of what was required to Native American farmers and ranchers for as long and as continuously as possible. That doesn't mean that only organizations that were in existence back in January of 1981 will get awards. We know there's many important and very well-run organizations that were founded later on, but it does mean that the length and continuity will be important factors considered, and an organization that was only active once in that period and now has a newfound desire to return to that area in light of the funding sources available is not likely to be rated as highly in the recommendations that we receive.
Great, thank you so much for that answer. And then next question is, if you provide scholarships in addition to other program activities, do you also answer the questions for intermediary applicants? And so, Marion, I'm going to turn that question over to you.
Yes, and the answer to that would be yes, because you'd be receiving fast track funds and then also disseminating them out to the larger community. So scholarship applicants would also be considered under the intermediary component.
Thanks, Marion. All right, our next question. We're an organization that addresses food security in an Alaska Native village, both through the management of a local farm and also through the restoration efforts to support healthy salmon populations, a major food source in our community. Will NAAFTF consider a project that includes traditional agriculture as well as restoration efforts to support subsistence resources? Christine, I'm going to turn that question over to you.
Sure. And I do want to answer this, but I also want to encourage everybody to look on the website, indianfarmclass.com, where we have the FAQ document, which actually does address in some detail some of these questions. So if you want to have a written source that you can refer back to in addition to the answer I'm going to give, please do take a look at that. We define agriculture broadly, and so any harvesting, cultivation or harvesting of natural resources, whether for food or for other purposes such as wool, leather, etc., would all be encompassed by our understanding of agriculture. There would have to be still the link to having had past services to Native American farmers and ranchers. And so there are both requirements would have to be met, both at the current purposes for agriculture and that some of the past services be not simply, I saw the reference to food security, not simply in providing food to those with experiencing food insecurity, but having done so in a way that is directing the efforts to those who are cultivating or harvesting food to support themselves economically as well as for subsistence purposes.
Great, thank you so much. And again, we can't emphasize enough for people to download that FAQ, which you can find the link to download that directly on the NAAF-FTF website. But Christine, I think you in part answered this, but I just want to make sure we're being really specific in terms of some of these questions we're getting. So it says some USDA programs serve commercial fishing. Will commercial fishing projects be eligible?
Yes, fishing is one type of agricultural activity that can be encompassed. I'm not sure quite what was meant by commercial fishing, because obviously if it were a large corporation rather than that was not specifically a Native American individual or group of individuals who were working as I say farmers and ranchers, and I guess I should say farmers, ranchers, or fishing in a fishing enterprise, then that would be my only concern, that it couldn't, when I hear commercial fishing, I start thinking of some of the big sort of multinational corporations that run many ships, and some of them may have Native Americans as crew, but they're not the ones who are controlling the enterprise. And so as long as the commercial part doesn't cancel out this being something for benefiting Native Americans. And the other thing I would say is all of the funds have to go for what's defined as charitable purposes. And so if you have an enterprise that is large enough and successful enough, providing services to such an organization might not be deemed within the tax code's definition of charitable purposes. So just with those caveats, certainly fishing is encompassed.
Great, thank you so much. And we did receive another question, a couple different questions again, that if you are denied the opportunity to compete for the full proposal, or you're denied overall and at any stage during this process, is there an appeals process? Again, Christine, you answered that question early on. This is not a legal process, correct? There's no appeals process for this grants process. Correct. Certainly not from being denied the opportunity to submit a full application after the LOI process. We're just asked to submit our recommendations to the court, and we have sort of full discretion as to how we make those recommendations. And we're doing it through this more open and formal process, but that does not include an appeal. And so then we will be submitting our recommendations to the judge without having any appellate review of what our recommendations are. It then will obviously go to the judge for his determination as to what he is going to approve. Great. And I think also some of the questions that have also come in is, will we be providing any reasons for why someone did not receive funding? And based on the volume of applications, we're not going to be able to provide any detail on those denials. But our scoring system is going to be pretty transparent, and it will all be subject to review by the court. So moving on to the next question, are these grant awards considered federal funds for audit and compliance purposes? Christine, can you answer that question?
I can't, and we actually addressed this somewhat in the memo on the tipping point. There are certain questions about how how this will be treated that we cannot. That's really a legal question that we cannot provide legal advice to an organization as to how to account for these funds. While the original source of the funds was the federal judgment fund that paid the money to the class in settlement of the claims, whether for various legal purposes, they would still be considered federal funds when the award is made upon recommendation of plaintiff's counsel and approval of the court without any say-so by the federal government, even though that was the original source of the funds. I don't know if that would be deemed to be federal funds for various accounting purposes. So there are various issues as we've flagged in the tipping point memo that we wanted to bring to your attention, but that you'd have to consult your own counsel on resolving. We're not able to give you an answer.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm seeing we have about 8 minutes left and about 20 more questions, so we're really going to try to prioritize and get through as many as possible. We'll also really note down your questions and also try to provide some information back via email as well at the Keepseagle Fast Track at echohawkconsulting.com, so you can contact us anytime. But we will try to get through a couple more questions. Marion, can several organizations under the same tribe apply?
I'm going to say that only one LOI per eligible applicant entity will be allowed. And so, like we've talked about, that's going to be a 501c3, a 7871, an educational institution, or an instrumentality of a state or federally recognized tribe. So if you had a different entity to apply under, and if the funds you were applying for were non-competing with each other, that is, they would not duplicate for the same project, then I would say yes. But as it is, we're asking that each eligible applicant entity only submit one LOI.
Great, thank you, Marion. Christine, will funds be awarded upfront or drawn for reimbursement once the grantees expend funds on the project?
The awards will be upfront because we don't, as I said, we don't have any ongoing organization to receive in reports and then reimburse funds. Once the court approves the awards, then they will be made.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, and Marion, I'll send this one to you. The webinar states funds will be used as additional funds for the purposes stated in the application. The FAQ states if you already have a project that meets eligibility requirements, you may request funding for that project. NAAFTS does not require the development of a new project. This seems slightly contradictory. Can you provide some further context, please?
I think what we're trying to get at here is we don't want the fast track funds to supplant any other funding that your organization has already received. So if you've got a project in place that meets fast track fund eligibility requirements, we don't want the fast track funds to replace or supplant those funds already secured. We don't require that you already have a project in place in order to be able to apply for the fast track funds. So if a new project that would meet fast track fund eligibility requirements, please do go ahead and submit. But if you've got an existing project that meets the eligibility requirements, we don't want the fast track funds to replace those funds already in place.
Basically, you could expand your existing project to serve more people with new funds, but we don't want to award funds to replace existing funds and then those existing funds get used for some other purpose, because the whole purpose of our process is to increase the services being provided to the Native American farming and ranching community.
Great, thank you, ladies. Our next question, and again, Marion, this one's going to come back to you. If the application seeks funding for a project, endowment, and regranting, how is the indirect cost rate going to be calculated or need to be calculated?
Right, so for the project cost, you would calculate that indirect at 15%. Endowment line item would not allow any indirect cost to be calculated on top of that. And then for the regranting funds, you would calculate 3% on top of that line item.
Great. Thanks, Marion. Christine, if partnering organizations are applying jointly, do you consider that a strength in the application? Also, how will you determine who completes the application procedure?
I think partnering organizations can be a strength. It would depend, of course, on the organizations and how they, how they would be setting up the project. We would want to make sure there wasn't, duplication in things. It would not increase the amount of, overhead that we would be willing to consider. And obviously, having two organizations could, in some ways, look like it would increase the overhead. So it would really depend on the specifics of the proposal. Ultimately, one organization has to apply and has to be independently eligible to be that applicant, and we would have to make sure we don't want any organization to be a shell company for some ineligible applicant that is really the grant recipient. We would really want to see that there is a true partnership, that each part of the partnership is bringing particular strengths to the process, and then look at it case by case.
Okay, great. All right, we are starting to run out of time here, and I'm just trying to look at how we prioritize the questions. And again, we want to remind you, again, we have a dedicated phone line at 877-544-9145, and that is open Monday through Friday. And you can leave a message at the times that we're not open, and those opening times are from 1 to 3 p.m. Central, Monday through Friday. Again, you can email us. But we'll go ahead and take one more question before we wrap it up here. And Christine, this one is, our board functions on a governance and fiduciary basis. Our executive director oversees our programs. Will a letter from the executive director serve to demonstrate eligibility, or does it have to be a resolution from the board?
Ordinarily, our preference would be for a resolution from the board. I'd need more specific detail to consider whether there's an exception to that, but generally speaking, it's the board resolution, because it's the board that has the governance of the organization and can legally bind the organization to the commitments that are set forth in the proposed resolution.
Okay, great. And I think this is a similar question. It's an important one, Christine, I'm going to come back to you on, is what type of documentation would be acceptable proof for services provided from 1981 to 2010?
The minimum for the LOI is the resolution that contains a brief summary, and whether if there's additional documentation that can be provided, that could be in the forms of an annual report for an organization that gives annual reports, even if not a full-blown annual report. If there was a report to prior grant makers about specific projects that are those prior service that you're now using to show your past services for this application. Things like that would be excellent sources. Sort of audited financial statements that show, here were some expenditures that we made for these specific purposes, that would be your prior services provided. There's a wide variety of documentation that ultimately can bolster element of your application, but for the LOI, what's essential is having that board resolution. And one of the things is we do recognize that we're covering a very long time period, and people will not necessarily have kept all of their records going back to the 1980s. And also we have a relatively short time period for the LOI, and therefore for the LOI piece, a resolution with sufficient detail and explanation would be sufficient, and then that will give us the information we need to decide on whether an organization can go to the next step.
Great, thank you so much. And everyone, that takes us right at time, or I think even a little bit over, so I want to thank everyone for joining today. Again, remind you that our technical assistance line is open Monday through Friday. You can email us at any time, and we apologize if we were not able to get to your questions today. There was probably at least a dozen more questions, great ones, that we can answer via phone or online via email. Today's webinar will be posted by tomorrow, the actual recording. Right now you can just download the slides, but you can actually download the entire recording tomorrow. So on behalf of Echo Hawk Consulting and the Class Council for NAA FTF and the Keepseagle Settlement, thank you so much, and we encourage you to get your application in before the deadline. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.